Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now at the outset of June 1944, there were just under 600,000 men enlisted with the Free French Forces, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. Now they had been fighting, some of them, for almost 4 years, from the very outset of the war. After being displaced by the Nazi invasion of France, some of them signed up and were fighting alongside their British and American counterparts in the years since. Now, by war's end, there would be almost 1.3 million men-at-arms under the French banner, which makes them the fourth largest Allied army involved in the ETO, which is pretty impressive when you think about some of the numbers involved. So, as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Now, before we get to the painting, it's worth a quick note on the uniforms themselves, because by the time we reach 1944, the Americans have been supplying through Lend-Lease a huge amount of equipment to the Free French Forces, which means that for the most part they would have been wearing largely American kit. There's still a preponderance of old British and even legacy French equipment, especially as the French would start reclaiming France. Old stocks of gear would filter back into use, but for the most part American gear is still going to be the most accurate, if such a thing could be said, for a late war French army. But, you know, here are a bunch of guys who have been fighting, some of them have been fighting since the start of the war, more than 3 years resisting the Germans in some form or other, so their opportunity to return home wearing their helmet, it says a lot. It says, for them at least, the French are back. So I would suggest it's still going to look cool, especially as a wargaming army, to have maybe 5 or 6 guys in a platoon. Find yourself some Adrian helmets and pop those in there because it will look great. Now this comes from the Woodbine Designs collection. There's actually a set of World War I heads for separate pieces, and they're very cool. There's also the Adrian helms from the Les Grognards from Wargames Atlantic, and there's also 3D printing options out there too, so there is a lot of ways you can get your hands on something a bit neat for your French force. But with that covered, let's get to the painting. This fella's been primed with Vallejo's Grey Primer Spray, although anything nice and light will do the job. Even a white, or Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter, maybe Grey Seer from Citadel. It's not too important, really just anything nice and light. And then we're going to base coat his skin. Now for this, I'm using Army Painter's Tanned Flesh, and we're going to go just straight over the top of his mustache as well. This will cover very nicely, although I am still going to come back and give it a second coat, just to make sure it's nice and solid. Now for his jacket, we'll apply a couple of coats of German Camo Beige, which, you know, with a name like that, it's always a bit of a laugh to put it on an American uniform, but it is the best color that we're going to have here for these jackets. I might swap to a slightly larger brush, to be honest. Now hold on to that beige, because you're going to need it again later. What I've got now is an Army Painter color. This is Combat Fatigues, and it is a very pale greenish sort of color. It's going to work great for our webbing and packs. You can also use here instead something like dark sand or Iraqi sand if you want to make the earlier produced khaki stuff. But this, I think, is going to be a little more widespread by this point. Now the M1 carbine had a canvas strap, so make sure that you're painting that in the same color. If you are painting him carrying a Garand, then the leather strap, something like mahogany brown, will work well for that nice warm leather. But the leather boots that he's wearing, I'm going to paint them in, funnily enough, Vallejo leather brown. And I'm also going to apply this. It's not technically the correct color, but I am going to dot in just a little bit of this for his shirt underneath. There is a color, literally US olive drab, which is a very dark brown. And once we shade it, it would look almost black, so it's not going to look quite right for that shirt, I would suggest. But up to you if you do want to use that correct color. As well as his boots, I've also painted in his hair and mustache, and the leather strap around this Adrian helmet. So, nice and quick, and of course with hair there isn't really a correct color. I'm going to use here, this is Russian Uniform World War II, and we're going to paint in his trousers. Now the herringbone twill material would fade quite quickly, so there are a lot of correct colors you could use here. Green-grey is also a good faded color, or US dark green if you want them to look brand new. Now we'll finally paint in the helmet. For this I'm going to use brown violet. You'll also see this listed as US olive drab, so 887 is the color you're looking for. Now for his carbine and any other wooden details, I'm using here beige brown. And I am going to paint straight over the top of anything that's going to be black later, because it will be much easier than trying to avoid it here. And then to finish off any black details, I'm going to use German grey, which is really more of a very dark blue-black. Black isn't actually terribly common in reality, like a true black, so you can use straight black paint here if you want, but I tend to think this looks a little more realistic, particularly once it's shaded. Now that's all of our base coats applied, but before we get to any tidy up and shading, let's apply that unit marking. So what I'm going to start with, I have here Vallejo Off-White. You can use a pure white if you like. Loaded up a small brush here. And what I'm going to do is start by painting fairly roughly. There we go. Just a little triangle shape on his arm. Rectangle. Rectangle, goodness. 4-year-olds can manage this. How do I keep messing up rectangles and triangles? Once that's had a chance to dry, we're going to add 2 stripes either side of this little white shape. I'm going to use first of all azure, and this is way lighter than it needs to be. But I want it to still be visible when we shade our uniforms. And for the red we'll use vermilion. Same principle applies, just add a few short lines to get a bar shape. Don't worry if you're running over the edges. Now we do want a little space at the top for France to be written in. I'm not going to write the letters, but just straighten out the top of the bars with your white. And then I'm going back to my German grey, or again you can use black. What I'm going to do is just dab lightly to get a little squiggle. As soon as I find there we go. And then finally back to our German camo beige. Now what we'll use this for is to get into the edges to straighten them out a bit. But also we're going to start shaping this into the shield shape with the rounded bottom. So take your time here and just back and forth a few times until you have the shape you want. I just realized I haven't hit record. So once you've done your tidy up, what you can do is apply, this is a quick shade mix of half and half Army Painter Strong Tone and their quick shade mixing medium, because I want the similar sort of consistency, but I don't want the color to be quite so dark. Once I've applied this, we'll let this dry somewhere for about half an hour. Anywhere that you can get big clumps of it while you're applying it, just shift it away with your brush. You want it covered, but not drowning. Now anywhere that you are getting really huge globs of it, which are persistent, go ahead, damp down a smaller brush with just a tiny bit of the mixing medium, and you can use it to wick away the worst offenders. Now once it is finally dry, you're going to get a slightly shiny finish from the wash, but don't worry about that, because we're going to matte varnish this as a final stage anyhow. What we'll move on to is painting in the skin. Now you can go back to tanned flesh, or you could use the Army Painter's Barbarian Flesh here instead. What I'm using is Cadian Flesh Tone from Citadel. I just like it. What I'm going to do is cover over most of the skin with this, and leave a little bit of our shaded tanned flesh in the recesses for a bit of depth. That'll look much better, and you can leave it there, but I like to go just a little bit further with most of my faces. So I've got some Kislev flesh, and I'm going to use this to accentuate cheekbones, his nose, his chin, and the backs of his knuckles. With a little more definition in his face, what I'm going to do is go back to a tiny touch of the white from earlier, and I'm just going to dab in the center bar to brighten this up a touch. Now that is a little hard to see before we go ahead and varnish him, but it's going to look much better at that point. What I'm going to move on to now is a few highlights for the uniform. Now, most of these colors, what I'd recommend is go and check out the video I did on painting with ivory as a universal highlight color. But what I have here, this is light mud from the Panzer Aces line, still a Vallejo color. And anywhere that you can get Vallejo paints, you'll probably be able to find Panzer Aces. This is a perfect highlight, and you don't have to mix it. I tend to find that a really useful highlight, and stumble onto it quite by accident. Now the next highlights I am going to skip through a little bit, because I've done most of these before. Every single one of these highlights is going to be a half and half mix of the original color with a touch of ivory, because I want them to be a little bit desaturated. If you're worried about how thick they go on, or if they're too light, what you can do is go back with a little bit of the base color and tidy things up. But it is worth pointing out that going on very bright, these will tone down a little bit as they dry. So now every highlight, like I said, half and half mix, some Vallejo ivory. Now, sharp highlights like this really are a style choice. Some people don't like them, and that's totally fair. They're a little desaturated, and I think they look much better on the table than they do on a miniature you're holding in your hands and photographing. But I like the look. You know, it's something that works for me, but I've done US infantry styles a few times on the channel, so you can pick and choose what you like the look of. I haven't highlighted his boots because I don't see the point, and I'm not going to highlight his gun because instead I'm turning here to Iron Warriors, which is a really dark gunmetal color. I think if I were to try and highlight the metal with a ivory mix, it's going to look really weird. So just a very dark gunmetal, almost black, and this will look quite cool. Now what I'm going to do is take him outside to hit him with a matte varnish spray, and you'll see what a difference that makes. Now honestly, it's good practice to be varnishing your miniatures anyway, but if ever you've come to the channel and asked me, oh, my shade dries shiny, what do I do? Pfft, matte varnish. It's always the answer. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and pop a base on him, and I'll include the recipe for that in the description. Let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our French soldier is complete. Now, even if you do go the route of putting them in entirely American helmets, I think the addition of that little French flag is really going to make a huge difference to the look of them. And if anyone does come along with any waterslide transfers for little French flags like that, I would love to hear about it. Now, luckily, the same method will work if you want to paint the same on any helmets. So for example, just a tiny wee tricolor on the right-hand side. Just lay down that white rectangle. I got the word right that time. And yeah, you can tidy up with your base color and then shade and treat everything else exactly the same. Very easy to do. So as always, thank you very much to XIXth Games for the light sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.